Sharing the slides at the Gable offices, and now it's going. There he is. All right, I'm
There
out.
we go. Thank you for buying me time, Demetrios. Awesome. Well, my talk will be a little bit shorter. I can speed through this, but essentially my title is The Rise of the Data Conscious Software Engineer and really trying to bridge the gap between data and software teams. So this is coming from our early preview of our book. If you go to gable.ai, you'll see the O'Reilly book. You can download the early release for free. So a lot of this material is coming from there, and you'll see this kind of logo in the corner for things I particularly reference. I'd like to start all my talks with like, how did I even get here? With my data engineering villain arc. I was hired as a data scientist at previous startups to do all the cool machine learning things. And when I got there, the reality was messy data lake, flaky batch jobs, and untrustworthy data. You see the spaghetti dag right there. I think that's just kind of the reality of a lot of data teams. And so what essentially happened was I started building the infra myself so I can do my job. But they were like, hey, you're actually pretty good at this. You should become a data engineer. And it turns out I loved kind of building data models over ML models. So it was a great fit for that. Next slide. So this experience led to the following questions, and ultimately why I started devoting so much of my time on data contracts. Like, why am I writing a book on this? Why did I spend the last few years just like focusing on this key problem? And essentially, these questions right here. Why is there such a huge disconnect between software engineers and data teams in respect to how data is used? I was told having all this data easily available to me in a data lake was a good thing, but why was it not matching my experience? Are the above just problems in my company, or is this like an industry-wide problem? And it's an industry-wide problem. And actually, that's what gravitated me towards working at Gable and Chad specifically was he was actually talking about this problem. And I was like, oh my gosh, it's not just me being incompetent in my job. This is actually something really hard that everyone's struggling with. And so then the next question was, well, how do I fix this problem? Next slide. And so the agenda for this talk is, why software engineering best practices alone are insufficient for data teams. I argue a solution for this is data contracts. And through that, some painful lessons from getting data contract buy-in. And through that, the other side of going through this process over and over again was identifying this person called the data conscious software engineer and kind of introducing who that is. And then finally, I end with, what data teams can do today. Next slide. And so why software engineering best practices alone are insufficient for data teams. Next slide. And this is pretty much the kind of experience that a lot of engineers have with data science. The typical stereotype is the data scientists build an ML model in their Python notebook, and they're like, this is great. It works great. It does all the great things. Engineer, here you go. Put it in production. And the engineer is just like, what is this? You expect me to put this in production? Like, it's a notebook. What do you even do with this, right? And so engineers are pretty skeptical of a lot of data teams in their engineering skills. Next slide. And so engineering best practices are very helpful in data, so I'm not against them. But having software engineering teams trust those practices implemented by data teams is a very difficult endeavor. And kind of speaking to that, in my last role where I shifted from being a data scientist to being a data engineer and going further and further into the application code base, it took over a year before the engineers trusted me to have read-write access to their transactional database. They were surprised when I did a unit test, right? Or I put things in production. It just was not their expectation of me. And so I had to build that trust over time. And I started learning that other data teams really start having that as well. Next slide. And so engineers are skeptical and rightfully so. While frustrating that like they didn't trust the work I was doing, even though I knew it was correct, I understood where they were coming from, and I probably would have been the same if I was in their shoes as well. And so software engineering teams are the ones held accountable for application uptime, managing a transactional database, and protecting their code base. And anyone implementing code outside of these constraints is a potential threat to the above. And why internally have so many best practices to prevent these issues, such as CI/CD, unit tests, version control, all the things we've been talking about in Shift Left. Furthermore, while all software engineers are aware of these standards, table stakes for them, it's more of a spectrum of understanding among the various data roles they interact with. So me being a data engineer, I had a lot of experience with engineering best practices. But when I was a data analyst, right, I was very close to the business, not thinking about things in production. And so there's like a litany, a spectrum of who they interact with and what's their expectation. And it's kind of unfair for them to really piece that out from every single data role. Especially, I think even a few years ago, defining what a data scientist was extremely hard. I think it still is probably. Next slide. And so I argue that a solution to this problem is data contracts. And I'll provide a quick introduction to what data contracts are. Next slide. So data contracts are a data architecture pattern that extends software-driven collaboration to data teams via API-like agreements that programmatically track and enforce expectations around data. And this is the big key thing within the CI/CD workflow. And we'll have some diagrams to show what that looks like. Next slide. And so what are data contracts? For contract-driven data management, it has the following properties. One, domain teams create data products. This is really, I think, coming from like the shift, not shift left, the data mesh kind of terminology. I think Zamac really pushed this really far. In addition, all data products must have a contract. Contract modifications follow a process. Again, this change management piece is like the crux of what data contracts really try to accomplish through technology. And then contract metadata is programmatically updated. We were talking about data catalogs earlier. I argue that data catalogs are the foundation for what's happening with kind of the operationalizing of data and of data quality. One of the first steps to get data contracts in place is you need a catalog. The presentation before on Iceberg, the reason why it's so powerful is it has a catalog to navigate the data lake, right? Data catalogs are quintessential for just understanding the vast metadata you have in your business. And then finally, consumers are informed of change and quality. When I was a data scientist, that was one of the hardest parts of my job when I go to the business person and be like, hey, this dashboard's gonna be gone for like a week. And they're like, why? And me explaining the intricacies of like why the data pipeline's late or why this batch job missed or why this one value is wrong, their eyes just glaze over, right? And so being able to communicate that effectively to the right people at the right time, under the right context, makes it very powerful. Next slide. And so what really starts is I call it the business logic lifecycle. And hopefully you can see this on the screen. But the way it starts is the business has an idea of what the reality is and what they want to capture. That's then translated to a team, typically engineers, where they have the application code, and they transfer that into code that puts that data, those expectations in the transactional database. That data is then replicated into an analytical database. And one thing I want to highlight here is that it is structured completely different. And so then the next step is they restructure again to insights to inform the business, and you have this loop. But again, thinking about change management, next slide. As they start to separate from reality, as they start to just not communicate well with each other, build in different silos, that's when you start having data quality issues, is this deviation from the truth and expectations. And so those X's is where data contracts really come in play to really prevent that. Next slide. And so this is the data contract workflow for this. And so where it starts, we'll start on the right side where you see that little red star, is you have a consumer who says, hey, these are my expectations for the data. This is how the business will use it. They then say, let's go put this under a contract. It'll be a YAML file typically, where it can programmatically and version controlled say, like, these are expectations. This is what we want to have under contract. Then the software engineer upstream has to agree to be on that contract. And that in itself is very powerful. You're finally having that conversation. I remember in my last data science role, one of the big unlocks for us was when my manager worked really hard to bridge the gap with the engineering team and get us involved in the product requirement document stage, where before they even started coding, we were able to negotiate with them saying like, hey, you should capture this, or maybe you don't structure it this way, right? This is providing a process for that and programmatically storing that. So then once that contract's in place, the developers, it can be a completely different developer, had no idea about this. They go about doing their developer thing, doing the software engineering thing, providing value to the company. And then they merge code and then the CI/CD check happens. They check, hey, did you change a data asset? And is that data asset under contract? If it didn't do any violations, happy go lucky, they pass a test like any other type of CI/CD test they have, and they move forward. But if there is a violation, there's kind of two kind of fail tiers. One, they will either be like, hey, this is a hard stop. This will be like detrimental to the business. You cannot merge this and let's have a conversation. Or it can be like a soft failure where it's like, it'll be worse to have this data blocked. We'll flag it, but let's keep it going. Next slide. And so these are the components of data contracts. Obviously, you have the data assets. That's the foundation of it. Next slide. Then you have the contract definition. So how do you define what the expectations are in the spec? What is the business logic? Do you have a data catalog place? If you have streaming data, maybe you have a schema registry. Next slide. Then you have the detection. So what is the data coming in? How's it changing? A big thing that's been really a huge unlock for data contracts, static code analysis, looking at the code itself and how that impacts data. There's multiple things you can do here. That'll be for a different talk though. And then finally, the next slide, you have the prevention. And I think the CI/CD component is the crux that actually operationalizes and automates all these checks. And I think one of the biggest gripes that I've seen talking around industry with data governance was they do all this work creating all these documents, talking to all these stakeholders. They have all these frameworks, and it's really important stuff. And the business sees value in it, but they can't enforce it because it's just in documents. And so incentivizing people to engage with that is much harder. And so I think really having this prevention step within the developer workflow via version control, via monitoring alerts and CI/CD, it really takes that hard work that a lot of governance people are doing and actually gives them teeth to actually enforce it. Next slide. And so going back to how this works for the CI/CD, so typically what will happen is you have your GitHub branch, you'll go merge your code or do a commit, and then from there, do a CI/CD check. You'll spin up a database with the expected schema, and this is for a streaming use case. So we'll check Kafka's schemas registry. Hey, did this match expectations, yes or no? And if it doesn't, it will block it and they can't merge the code. And that's one of the most kind of impactful ways to get the attention of software engineers is they want merge code. They want to show they're showing progress. And if you get anything in the way, they're like, oh, wait, what do I have to do now to make sure this goes through, right? So I think CI/CD has been the huge kind of component to actually make this important to other software engineers and not just data people. Next slide. And so here we have an example of kind of what these building blocks look in action. On the left, we have an example contract spec and YAML. And then on the right is one of those messages that the engineer would get in their pull requests when they're trying to do code review or understand why something is breaking. They have the context, they know who to reach out to. And so they're incentivized to take action before the data changes. Next slide. And so that is data contracting and be thinking like, wow, this sounds great. How do I get started? I had the same kind of experience as well. It's like, I just want to run into it, tell the whole world about amazing data contracts. I think they'll believe me too. Not so much. There is some things we had to learn along the way to really get to this point where we found the pattern to get contracts bought in by the wider business and specifically software engineers. Next slide. And so hard lesson number one. Next slide. Data teams who thought they could only implement data contracts downstream in the database, they were really not set up for success. Next slide, we'll have this diagram right here. This is a typical data stack that you would typically see. Obviously, huge simplification, but many times what's happening is they want to put data contracts on E and G, really downstream. And why would they do that? Well, one, that's where they can control. They don't need to get permission from upstream teams. They can just implement it there. So they feel like they can move quicker. In addition, typically when they're looking at data contracts, they're having some huge data quality, data trust issues. And so they really want to protect their data going over to their business users to maintain that trust and stop having basically have egg on their face, being like, why is the data wrong, even though they didn't do anything about that. And so I argue that's a trap because of the simplicity, because of trying to stop the bleeding with the trust, it gives a false sense of solving issues. But then what happens is they have constraints for downstream, but upstream, they're still getting bad data. And now they have all these constraints and checks that's slowing them down. And so now their timeliness is starting to drop because now they have all these constraints stopping the data flows. The downstream teams are still mad because the data is late. And so I've seen this kind of a couple times over and over again where they need to go after the actual root of the problem. The fundamental logic in the business is changing the data model, and they need to account for that change management. Next slide. And so they want to work upstream. They want to go to the engineers. Well, the next challenge we've seen is many data teams were hesitant to talk to their upstream engineer colleagues. If you think about it, if you're a data scientist saying like, hey, my data is broken, every time you go to the engineering team, you're bringing up problems, right? Or maybe time you did bring up problems, but nothing ever changed. I remember for me, when I had data pipelines go down that needed help from other teams, easily put on the backlog because data was a nice to have while the application code was like driving the business, right? And so, one of the first things you need to do if you're in this position is like, you cannot pursue data contracts If you do not have a relationship with your engineering team, you need to go foster that. Next slide. And this is what we're seeing from many data teams. When a model goes down, they're just kind of pointing at each other rather than looking at the system itself. Next slide. And so finally is, all right, it will talk to the engineers. What was most surprising for these data teams, and I think Zaki talked about it in his kind of Glassdoor presentation at the earlier conference, is like nearly every time you bring up data contracts to engineering teams, they would say something along the lines of, wait, the data team is not already doing this. And they were just flabbergasted. Next slide. And there's like kind of two kind of components to facets of this. Is one, engineering teams expect that these constraints already exist for data teams. This is table stakes for them. So they just assume that like the rest of the technical business is already doing this, and they're shocked that it wasn't happening. Or the other side was software engineers underestimated how hard this task is for data compared to code. And so you think about code is changing. It's very discrete. Obviously, there's a lot of complexity to that. But then you add data to it. Now it's code plus data changing. And so the kind of complexity doubles for that. And so I don't think they really account for how hard it is to do that. Next slide. And so the missing link we saw, all the teams that actually overcame all these three kind of friction points, was what I call a data conscious software engineer. Next slide. And very, very intentional saying conscious and not data aware. Conscious is that you're painfully aware and sensitive to the pains of that. There's a level of empathy to that for there. Next slide. And so teams who overcame these challenges have one similarity. Someone within the software engineering organization had a nuanced understanding of the relationship between software and data workflows and became a champion for supporting data teams because they recognized the impact of data on the wider org. And so I call this person a data conscious software engineer. And I argue that identifying this person should be like the first step in your data contract journey. And something I really want to highlight here, 1 second, lost my place in there, is for this data conscious software engineer is that I lost the thought. I was freestyling it. Guess I won't anymore. Next slide. Well, what are the characteristics of the data conscious software engineer? The first one is they're often staff level or above, where their scope oversees the wider architecture of the business, and thus they have purview of how the software and data intersects. And so many times when you're talking to a team that has maybe only focused on one service, right? They're very hyper focused on what their application does. But once you start having a more kind of holistic view, you start seeing how these things don't talk to each other, how they have different silos. And your job is to kind of fix that. Next slide. Second thing is they have been part of a data team or deeply involved in a major data initiative. A common one is building out a data platform, where they took ownership of the handoff of data between software and data teams. Let's go to the third one. Despite their deep involvement in data, they recognize it's not their area of expertise and thus rely on a specialized knowledge of data teams, such as engineers, scientists, or analysts. I think maybe you've been in that role. I've been in startups, so many times there is no data team. It's just software engineers, and they're the ones that first build the databases, and then you hire data engineers, and you come back, and you're like, oh, we need to fix some things. We actually need to put a proper data model. We actually need to separate, transactional and analytical database, various things like that. And so they recognize where their limit is for their expertise and know how to bring in the right people to complement it. Next slide. They view data as a product within the organization, and they seek ways to maintain this data in the same fashion they maintain software they see. We've been hearing this a lot, data as a product. Basically, is data shifting from being, hey, we're just doing a dashboard, doing reports, to actually being a line of business driving revenue or mitigating risk that you serve to people or they serve the insights. Next slide. And then finally, leadership views these individuals as special ops who are often moved to different units within the organization, and they create structure and fix the most challenging problems across the code base. And many times when I kept on coming across these data conscious software engineers and multiple calls I would do, often I would hear, yeah, I just moved to this team, or yeah, I got pulled from this team and added to this leadership right here. Because leadership saw the value they had in really taking complex messiness and putting structure and connecting the wider business together. Next slide. And so what data teams can start doing today, knowing that there's this data conscious software engineer somewhere out there in an organization. Next slide. While this persona is a unicorn today, I imagine they're hidden within your very org and without anyone really realizing it. And if I were on a data team considering data contracts, I would highly prioritize finding a software engineer with these 5 characteristics and building a relationship with them. Now, do they have all 5 characteristics? Characteristics? Maybe, maybe not. It doesn't matter. But you need to find someone who's actually really thinking about the empathy of data teams and how it connects with software engineers. They can also potentially be the missing link to improving data utilization within the organization. And I now just remembered the point I want to say earlier, now that I have this slide here, was the biggest thing that this data conscious software engineer does is translate data language to the software engineering team for them to get it and get bought in. And one of the big kind of aha moments we had at Gable was actually talking about data lineage to software engineers. So us data people, we understand data lineage. We're like, hey, data goes here, moves there, goes there. We're following it. But when we talk to software engineers, they're like, data lineage, what's that? Then we'll show them a graph and they'll be like, oh, you mean a dependency graph? And we're like, yes, that is what we mean. And essentially is that having that translation layer, you can be talking about this very similar things, but having that key stakeholder that understands who you're trying to sell to internally within the business can be the game changer that actually starts getting you buy-in. Next slide. And so that concludes it. And so here's a little QR code that you can scan if you want to download the early release book for free, and we can do Q&A. So you can stop sharing.
Nice. Wait, don't stop sharing. Keep that QR code up.
Oh yeah, keep the
Don't
QR
let
code.
Why? I didn't even get time to grab my phone. I want to get that. Oh, man. So, all right. Amit was saying something that I feel like is worth bringing up here. A data conscious software engineer can also be a data product manager focusing on a data product.
Cool, we got it back. So what was the question again?
Focus, Mark. Come on, what are we doing
Focus.
here? You keep forgetting thoughts and stuff midway through your talk.
Man, I'm just so smitten by your music. I just lost track.
All right. Data conscious software engineer can also be a data product manager focusing on a data product. It's not really a question,
Yeah.
it's just a statement that I thought you might
Yeah,
have
I
some
mean, I would
thoughts on.
actually really agree with that statement too, because again, think about it. What does a product manager do? They oversee the larger business. They're deep talking to the engineers and they're talking to the business and they're translating between the business and the engineers. I can see that being a very, very similar role.
Yeah, it feels like that translation layer has been spoken about many times today, and it is very interesting how we think that layer can be and what that actually does and how it gets enabled by different tools or different processes, whatever it may be. So I like that you're bringing it to that. We got another question for Mark. If you're working for a small team or a small project, at what point do you recommend data contract practices? Sometimes
That's
as
such
the
a
organization gets bigger, it's harder to implement this practice, especially if you're not a manager. Any advice on how to improve your practice?
Yeah. So I think one thing to separate is that if you're a small org versus you're a small team,
Hmm.
because what really data contracts is helping out with is this change management. And something we talk about in the book is called Dunbar's number. Is after you reach a certain point, your human mind can't manage as many connections as possible. And so communication breaks down, the business breaks down, right? And so that's where change management data contracts become very powerful. But if you're not near that number and you're a small team, data contracts may be way too heavy. You can get by with just a Slack message and walking over to the desk, right? Because there's only a few people that you interact with. So that's also another thing that I don't try to push data contracts for every single org. You really have to have this scale communication problem that warrants needing to automate this change management and communication.
Well put. I like it. And then I think you make a good call out there. The differences between small team and small org, right?
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah, because
there
many
was
times you can
this other.
have like data teams can be this nice to have that they're trying to experiment with to understand like, hey, what does data look like to grow this function, right? And for example, like the many startups I've been at, right? Heavy software engineers for like the first few years, and then they start adding a data team. At the last role, I was the first data science hire for that, and we slowly started building up. There's a lot of data involved, but it was like a team of two or three working with like 30 engineers.
Yeah. And it's funny because at that point you realize why it just about all of us who have been to data meetups over time, you hear some form of a talk from a data practitioner that says something along these lines that I'm going to paraphrase. We need to make data a first class citizen. We've
Hear that
all
all the
heard that
time.
talk, right? We've all heard somebody because they've been scarred in the past. And so they're going to a meetup and they're like, I need to change some things. Hopefully, I can plant the seed and not let you repeat that mistake.
And this may be, well, not, I don't want to say too spicy, but like
Ooh.
I would argue that data kind of already is. It's just that everyone's talking about it differently. They're not aligned on the same definition. So that they're basically arguing on the semantics of it. At the end of the day, everyone wants stable code, a stable product, users on it, understanding how you can improve it, right? Software and data hand in hand, but it's the how you do it and how you prioritize it. And all that gets lost in kind of conversation. And that's where I think data contracts are really powerful because it provides a mechanism and framework to have that conversation and have it under version control. So that way people can be held accountable to it.
Yeah, awesome. So another question coming through here, and this one has come up a few times throughout the day, so I think it is maybe blog worthy since you're the artist here with the blog and the pen is your sword. What are the intervals of data contract updates? Like if the code is refactored, is that an automatic need for a contract update or something similar?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I think there's something that needs to be understood is there an unexpected change? That's where contracts are really powerful and that you need to, put constraints on the code or the data itself. Or back to that business logic lifecycle, is the business evolving and the data actually and code actually does need to change, such as a refactor. Then I would argue the contracts itself need to change to align with this new reality of that. And so typically what happens is that it's going to change regardless. But do you want to have version control and change management and kind of a conversation about it? Or do you just want to find out later where your data model just kind of breaks and blows up on you?
Mm. So there was another part to that question that I'm going to get to now is what major reversible decisions need to be made to incorporate a data contract on a mature application?
Mm, that's really good. So what kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, the first step is the data catalog. You have to understand what's there. I wish you can see this in the book now. We're currently editing it, but we're talking about how do you find your first data contract project? And it's a concept we call steel threads, where
Mm,
essentially is you identify, all right, here are the potential data products that we have in the business, especially if an established business, you're gonna have like hundreds, maybe thousands of them, right? You
yeah.
then need to start identifying which data products are actually driving value for the business. And then among those, which of those teams you have active relationships with. And then from there, which teams actually want to work with you. And then
Mm,
which ones can actually get budget for you. And slowly you'll start being willing down to like a few key set of projects. And then your job there is then to basically crush that POC and be like, hey, we improved data through this process. Um, Other teams, you should try to adopt this as well. And you start building momentum that way. And so the thing is, what's the phrase, how you eat elephant one bite at a time? You have to
mm,
identify, start small, but highly impactful, and then grow from there. So you shouldn't try to boil a whole ocean at once when it comes to this.
brilliant. I think we
And I think
are
we're at time.
we're 3 minutes over time. That's how
Oh
bad I
no.
am at this whole timekeeping thing.
Perfect.
There's
Well, I'll stop
another,
sharing and then we can switch over to our next guest.
yeah, and there's more questions that are in the chat and in the
Yeah.
Q&A, so I'll let
Perfect.
you get to those when you're ready. In the meantime, we got another speaker that I'm going to bring onto the stage because Mark is out of here. Apparently, he's off the
I'm
stage.
still here. I'm just switching over.
He exited stage left. He shifted left on us, and now he shifted so far left, he's out of the frame